Today, we are going to discuss a new important case that affects copyright law, Warhol Foundation versus Goldsmith, presented by Kelly Herzig.
As I mentioned, we're going to be discussing Warhol Foundation versus Goldsmith, which is a new U.S. Supreme Court case on copyright infringement. The case clarifies the copyright defense of fair use. The Warhol case deals with the transformative nature of a copyrighted work and fair use of that work in a secondary or follow-on work under U.S. copyright, specifically the U.S. Copyright Act of 1976. It's important to understand that a fair use of a copyrighted work is not unlawful under federal copyright law. It's an exception to the copyright protections otherwise afforded to the original creator. This was a 7-2 vote affirming the Second Circuit. Justice Sotomayor wrote the majority opinion. Justice Gorsuch wrote a concurring opinion, which Justice Jackson joined. And Justice Kagan wrote the dissent, which Chief Justice Roberts surprisingly joined in. At issue was the Prince series, created by Andy Warhol in 1984, based on a photograph of the musician Prince by rock and roll photographer Lynn Goldsmith. Litigation ensued over whether there was a copyright infringement of Goldsmith's original photo or whether the Prince portrait was fair use of the original. Let's discuss the specifics of the case. Here is the full citation from May 18, 2023. And here are the pertinent facts. Lynn Goldsmith, a working photojournalist and rock and roll photographer, took copyrighted photos of Prince in 1981. She took some of the photos in her studio and some after a Prince concert. In 1984, Vanity Fair paid Goldsmith $400 for a one-time license for use of one of her photos of Prince. The magazine then commissioned Andy Warhol to transform the photo of Prince in his signature style for an article they were doing on Prince. Andy Warhol was perhaps one of the most well-known and celebrated artists of the 20th century. He was known for reformatting and silkscreening the likenesses of celebrities and even ordinary items like soup cans, often in bright colors, and then painting on the silkscreen print. In the case of the photo of Prince, Warhol did a series of 14 prints and 2 drawings, all of which were variations of the original headshot of Prince taken by Goldsmith, and probably also in violation of the one-time license she granted. After Prince died in 2016, the Warhol Foundation was paid to reproduce a Warhol Prince series print, though it was a different one than the original was published in 1984. After Andy Warhol died in 1987, his foundation took over control of his works. However, the foundation no longer owns the original Prince series, having sold the originals to collectors and museums and transferred some of them to the Warhol Museum. However, the foundation does retain copyright over the images. In 2016, Vanity Fair paid the Warhol Foundation $10,000 to license the use of orange prints on the cover. Goldsmith was not credited and received no compensation. This fact weighed heavily on the majority of justices in the case. It is this 2016 commercial use of the image that is at the heart of this copyright infringement case, not the original 1980s creation of the Prince series, which arguably exceeded the agreed upon license from 1984. The Supreme Court is very specific that its holding in Warhol versus Goldsmith does not decide or address the creation of the original series, or if other uses of the series might be considered fair use. This case is solely about the 2016 commercial use of the orange Prince portrait in Vanity Fair magazine. Warhol Foundation originally filed a declaratory judgment action seeking a ruling that the use of the Prince photo was fair use. Goldsmith counterclaimed for copyright infringement. The foundation won summary judgment in the trial court, and Goldsmith appealed to the Second Circuit. The Second Circuit overturned the trial court's award of summary judgment, and the Supreme Court affirmed the Second Circuit's decision. When they took up the case, the Supreme Court granted certiorari on a single issue. Was the Warhol Foundation's use of the Goldsmith photo in 2016 fair use, or was the use copyright infringement? Specifically, the Supreme Court considered the following narrow question. The sole question presented is whether the first fair use factor, the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of a commercial nature, or is for nonprofit educational purposes weighs in favor of the foundation's recent commercial licensing to Condé Nast, the owner of Vanity Fair. And here is the holding. The court ruled that the purpose and character of the Andy Warhol Foundation's particular commercial use of Lynn Goldsmith's photograph does not favor the foundation's fair use defense to copyright infringement based on 17 U.S.C. Section 1071 of the U.S. Copyright Act of 1976. Before we look at some of the details in the case, let's step back and look at what the definition of copyright actually is. Copyright involves the protection of the expression of a creative work, meaning the protection of the fixed form that expresses ideas. Copyright protects a diverse range of creative works, things such as motion pictures, periodicals, plays, music, books, sound recordings, photographs, lectures, works of art, and computer programs. It does so to foster creativity and to promote the progress of both arts and science. There are 3 criteria for a creative work to be copyrighted. It must be fixed, meaning set out in a tangible medium of expression. It must be original, and it must be creative. To be copyright, the work has to be created by a human. Art created by nature, animals, plants, or machines cannot be copyrighted. For example, content that is solely created by AI, that is computer generated without human creativity or authorship involved, cannot be copyrighted according to the current rules issued by the U.S. Copyright Office. If a work is copyrighted, the creator holding the copyright has a set of rights that includes the right to produce, reproduce, and license the copyrighted work and to prepare derivative works. Copyright isn't absolute. There is a balance between creativity, which often builds from other works, and the protection of the original creator's rights to their own work. Because of that balance, the law protects the fair use of copyrighted material. Let's take a closer look at the fair use doctrine. The exclusive rights of the copyright owner are subject to limitation by the fair use doctrine. The doctrine provides that a portion of a copyrighted work may be reproduced for the purposes of criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. The list is not intended to be exhaustive, but you can see the kind of use that is generally protected by the fair use doctrine. Courts use a 4-part test to determine if the fair use doctrine provides a defense to copyright infringement. To determine whether a particular use is fair, the statute has enumerated 4 factors to be considered. The factors set forth general principles, the application of which requires judicial balancing, depending on relevant circumstances. That's a quotation from Google versus Oracle America, the U.S. Supreme Court on Fair Use in 2021. Now, under fair use, there are 4 categories. The first is the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of a commercial nature or is for nonprofit educational purposes, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole, and the effect of use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. Now that we've done a refresher on what a copyright is and what the fair use doctrine generally covers, let's talk about the fair use doctrine in Warhol Foundation versus Goldsmith. Historically, particularly in the art world, artists would build on other artists' works to create new works. That's just the way creativity works in the art world. There's nothing new under the sun, as the old saying goes. In the modern era, the new art must be sufficiently transformative to avoid copyright infringement. The word transformative comes from a case from 1994 in the Supreme Court called Campbell versus Afcup Rose Music. Now, whether a work was transformative, different enough from the original, has dominated the analysis of fair use in the courts since Campbell. The Warhol Court refocused on not just the transformative nature of the secondary work, which is a matter of degree according to the court, but also on the use of the secondary work, not just its character. The Supreme Court in Warhol concentrated on the first prong of the 4-part test, which, as I just said, is the purpose and character of the use. including whether such use is of a commercial nature or is for nonprofit educational purposes. The majority opinion ultimately found that Warhol's changes to Goldsmith's original photo were insufficiently transformative to fall within fair use for commercial purposes. The court really did focus on the idea of commercial purposes, particularly since Goldsmith had been paid in 1984 for her work, but not in 2016. The actual analysis in Warhol Foundation versus Goldsmith is fairly detailed. So I want to break it down based on the main points of both the majority opinion and the dissenting opinion. I did not include the concurring opinion because it is rather short. So let's talk about the majority opinion first. One of the major questions the court asked is, does the use merely supplant the original, or does it instead add something new with a further purpose or character? As the court noted, the first prong considers the reasons for and nature of the copier's use of an original work. The central question it asks is whether the use merely supersedes the objects of the original creation, supplanting the original, or instead adds something new with a further purpose or different character. The court also focused on the fact that the larger the difference, the more likely the first factor weighs in favor of fair use. It becomes transformative use and not just copying. As the majority noted, the first factor asks whether and to what extent the use at issue has a purpose or character different from the original. The larger the difference, the more likely the first factor weighs in favor of use. A use that has a further purpose or different character is said to be transformative, but that is a matter of degree. The degree of transformation required to make transformative use of an original work must go beyond that required to be derivative. Finally, the majority looked at if the use shares the same or highly similar purposes and the secondary use is commercial, the fair use factor is likely to weigh against fair use absent some other justification for copying. The majority concluded that the first fair use factors favor Goldsmith, largely because the specific use that Goldsmith challenges is the licensure by Warhol's Foundation of his print to a magazine, a use that shares substantially the same purpose as the uses Goldsmith commonly made of her photographs, portraits of musicians in magazines and other print media. This was the same use Goldsmith was paid for in 1984. It seems clear that the absence of a licensing fee or agreement the second time around the Warhol portrait was used, and by the same magazine, made all the difference. As the majority noted, any fair use analysis must focus on the specific use at issue. The use was basically the same in the eyes of the majority. According to the Warhol majority, if an original work and secondary use share the same or highly similar purposes, and the secondary use is commercial, the first fair use factor is likely to weigh against fair use absent some other justification for copying. So now let's talk about the dissent. They raised a couple of very good points. The dissent pointed out that fair use allows artists to use existing works to create new ones, and by constricting fair use, the majority opinion hampers creativity and creative freedom. The majority opinion also misconstrues prior precedent on fair use, particularly on transformative art and copying, at least according to the dissent. Okay? Now, despite those misgivings and worry that the ruling will stifle future creative freedom, ultimately, when the court examined that first factor, remember this was a very narrow ruling, the court ruled 7-2 that the Foundation's use of Goldsmith's photographs was not protected by fair use because the work shared a similar purpose in the depiction of prints and magazine articles, and because of the nature of the commercial license in 2016. Naturally, a case like Warhol versus Goldsmith, such an important case, has generated a lot of commentary by legal scholars, both for and against the opinion. So let's look at some of the potential applications of fair use based on the Warhol decision. Like the dissent, there are many people who believe that there will be a chilling effect on creativity, that it has thrown the art world into a chaos, and that fair use is no longer just transformative like artists have intended to rely on. They believe that there will be a chilling effect on future art licensing and sales. Sales, of course, are what artists want. They want to earn money from their art. On the other hand, there are those who believe that the Warhol case offers greater protections for creators and artists. There are others who believe that the Warhol case might potentially support cases of artists claiming AI programs have used their style or even their copyrighted works to produce images. We will have to see how the courts deal with fair use in the future based on the recalibrated test from Warhol versus Goldsmith. It's going to be an interesting ride.
If you have any questions about the Warhol case or copyright law in general, please email me and I will be happy to discuss it with you. Also, all the pictures that I used in this presentation are royalty-free, free to use, and are for an educational purpose.